There are things in life you do for love, and others you do to protect the ones you love. I did both. And to this day, 60 years later, I still wake up in the middle of the night wondering if I did the right thing. My name is Dorothy Mae Sullivan. I'm 81 years old, and this is the story I've never told anyone, not even my own children. This wedding ring here, sitting in this old tin box, it holds the weight of a decision that no mother should ever have to make. But I made it. And if you're a mother, maybe you'll understand why. You see, back in 1962, in Cedar Falls, Kentucky, women like me didn't have many choices. We were expected to endure, to stay quiet, to keep our families together no matter what the cost. We were told that marriage was sacred, that we should stand by our husbands through thick and thin. But sometimes love demands something terrible. Sometimes protecting your babies means crossing a line you never thought you'd cross. And what I did that night, Lord forgive me, it was terrible. It went against everything I was raised to believe, everything the church taught me, everything society expected of me. But I'd do it again. Because when you're a mother, there's no line you won't cross to keep your children safe. No line at all. Let me take you back to where it all began. Cedar Falls, Kentucky, 1962. It was a small mining town where everybody knew everybody, where the church bells rang every Sunday morning and the whistle from the coal mine marked the rhythm of our days. I was 21 years old then, just a young woman with dreams that seemed as big as the Kentucky sky. I had married Frank Sullivan when I was barely 19, and by 21, I already had 3 beautiful children. There was Michael, my oldest at 4, with his father's dark hair and my stubborn streak. Then came little Sarah, barely 3, with pigtails that bounced when she laughed, and baby Tommy, who was just learning to walk on those chubby little legs. Frank worked down in the mines, just like his father before him and his father before that. It was honest work, hard work, the kind that put food on the table and a roof over our heads. We lived in a small white house on Maple Street, with a front porch where I'd sit and shell peas while watching the children play in the yard. Those were simple times, or at least they seemed simple from the outside. Frank would leave for work before dawn, his lunch pail in one hand and his thermos of coffee in the other. He'd kiss me goodbye, ruffle the children's hair, and walk down that gravel road with the other men heading to the mine. In those early days, he was a good man, a good father. He'd come home tired but happy, swinging Tommy up in the air while Sarah ran to hug his legs and Michael showed him the rocks he'd collected that day. We'd sit together on the porch after dinner, Frank smoking his pipe while I mended clothes and the children caught fireflies in mason jars. Sunday mornings found us all dressed in our best clothes, walking hand in hand to the little Baptist church at the end of Main Street. Frank sang hymns in his deep baritone voice, and I felt so proud to be his wife, so blessed to have our little family. The other wives would compliment me on how well-behaved my children were, how handsome my husband looked in his Sunday suit. I thought we had everything we needed. Love, faith, a home, healthy children. What more could a woman ask for? But coal mining is a hard life, and it changes a man in ways you don't see coming. The work was dangerous, backbreaking, and the pay was never quite enough. Frank started coming home later, stopping at Murphy's Tavern with the other miners to wash the coal dust from their throats with whiskey. At first, it was just on Fridays, then Saturdays too. Soon it was every night, and my sweet, gentle husband began to change. The man who used to sing lullabies to our babies started raising his voice over the smallest things. The hands that once held me tenderly began to clench into fists when he was angry. And Frank was angry more and more often. Angry at the mine bosses, angry at the bills piling up on our kitchen table, angry at a world that seemed to be passing him by while he worked himself to death underground. I told myself it was just the stress, just the whiskey talking. I made excuses for him to the neighbors, to my mother, to myself. This was just a rough patch, I thought. All marriages have rough patches. Frank was a good man underneath it all, he just needed time, needed patience, needed understanding. I became an expert at reading his moods, at keeping the children quiet when he came home with that dark look in his eyes, at smoothing things over with gentle words and careful steps. I thought if I could just be a better wife, if I could just manage everything perfectly, things would go back to how they used to be. But things didn't go back to how they used to be. They got worse. Much worse. The drinking became heavier, and with it came a darkness in Frank that I'd never seen before. It started small, the way these things always do. A harsh word here, a shove there, always followed by apologies and promises that it would never happen again. Frank would wake up the next morning, shame written all over his face, bringing me wildflowers from the field behind our house and kissing my forehead like he used to when we were courting. "I'm sorry, Dorothy," he'd whisper, his voice thick with regret. "I don't know what gets into me. You know I love you, don't you? You and the children mean everything to me." And I wanted to believe him. Lord, how I wanted to believe him. Because admitting the truth would mean admitting that the man I married, the father of my children, was becoming someone I didn't recognize. Someone I was starting to fear. The children began to change too. Michael, my brave little boy, started stuttering when his father was around. Sarah stopped laughing as much, and she'd hide behind my skirt whenever Frank's voice got too loud. Baby Tommy would cry inconsolably whenever he heard his father's footsteps on the porch, as if even at his young age, he could sense the tension that filled our home like smoke. I found myself making excuses constantly. When my mother noticed the bruise on my arm, I told her I'd bumped into the kitchen door. When the preacher's wife asked why the children seemed so quiet at church, I said they were just tired from playing too hard. When Mrs. Henderson next door gave me concerned looks over the fence, I'd smile and wave like everything was perfectly normal. Because in 1962, in a small town like Cedar Falls, a woman's problems were her own to solve. There were no shelters for battered wives, no hotlines to call, no social workers to intervene. A woman's place was with her husband, for better or worse, and admitting that your marriage was falling apart was admitting failure as a wife, as a woman, as a person. The church taught us that marriage was sacred, that a good Christian woman could change her husband through love and prayer and patience. So I prayed. God, how I prayed. I prayed for Frank to find his way back to the man he used to be. I prayed for strength to endure whatever trials the Lord had set before me. I prayed for my children to somehow not be damaged by the fear that was becoming our daily bread. But my prayers seemed to bounce off the ceiling and fall back down around me like autumn leaves. Frank's anger grew like a cancer, spreading from the mind to our home, from his frustrations to his fists. The worst part wasn't even the physical pain, though there was plenty of that. The worst part was watching my children learn to tiptoe around their own father, watching them flinch when he moved too quickly, watching the light in their eyes dim a little more each day. I realized I wasn't just failing as a wife, I was failing as a mother. Because a mother's first job, her most sacred duty, is to protect her children. And I was failing at that every single day. The question that kept me awake at night wasn't whether Frank would hurt me again, it was whether he would hurt them. And deep down, in that place where we keep the truths we're afraid to face, I already knew the answer. The night that changed everything was a Tuesday in October 1962. I remember because it was the night before Michael's 5th birthday, and I had spent the afternoon baking his favorite chocolate cake, hiding it in the pantry where he wouldn't find it. The leaves were turning golden outside our kitchen window, and there was that crisp smell of autumn in the air that usually made me feel hopeful. Frank had been having a particularly bad week at the mines. There'd been an accident with one of the machines, and production was behind, which meant smaller paychecks for everyone. I could see the worry etched deep in the lines around his eyes, the way his jaw clenched when he thought no one was looking. I tried to make everything perfect that evening. I cooked his favorite dinner, pot roast with all the fixings, and made sure the children were clean and quiet when he walked through that front door. But I could tell from the heavy way his boots hit the porch steps that it was going to be one of those nights. Frank stumbled in around 8 o'clock, reeking of whiskey and cigarette smoke, his work clothes still dirty from the mine. His eyes had that glassy, unfocused look that I'd learned to dread. "Where's my dinner?" he demanded, even though I'd kept his plate warm in the oven for over 2 hours. "Right here, honey," I said, keeping my voice soft and steady. "Let me just heat it up for you." But as I moved toward the stove, little Tommy came toddling into the kitchen, his favorite stuffed bear dragging behind him. At barely 2 years old, he didn't understand the need to be invisible when Daddy was in one of his moods. He just saw his father and wanted love, the way children do. "Daddy!" Tommy squealed with delight, his chubby arms reaching up to be held. "Up. Up." Frank looked down at his youngest son with eyes that held no warmth, no recognition of the pure love being offered to him. "Get that kid away from me," he slurred, pushing past Tommy so roughly that the little boy stumbled and fell backward. I rushed to pick up Tommy, but he was already crying, more from confusion than hurt. "It's okay, baby," I whispered, trying to soothe him. "Daddy's just tired." I said, "Keep that brat quiet." Frank roared, and I saw something in his face that made my blood run cold. This wasn't just anger anymore. This was rage, pure and simple, looking for a target. I tried to hustle Tommy out of the kitchen, but he was crying louder now, that heartbroken wail that only a confused toddler can make. And that sound, that innocent sound of a child in distress, seemed to snap something in Frank's mind. He grabbed Tommy right out of my arms before I could stop him. "You want to cry?" he snarled. "I'll give you something to cry about. What happened next will haunt me until my dying day." Frank shook that little boy so hard I could hear Tommy's teeth chatter. Then he threw him, actually threw my baby, against the kitchen wall like he was nothing more than a rag doll. The sound Tommy's small body made when it hit that wall, the silence that followed, the way he just crumpled to the floor and didn't move, didn't cry, didn't make any sound at all. Time stopped. Everything stopped. I dropped to my knees beside my baby, my hands shaking as I checked for signs of life. Tommy's eyes were closed, his little face pale as paper, and there was blood, so much blood, coming from somewhere on his head. "Tommy?" I whispered. "Tommy, baby, can you hear Mama?" Behind me, I could hear Frank stumbling around, muttering something about kids needing to learn respect, but his voice sounded like it was coming from underwater. All I could focus on was my baby, my precious little boy, lying so still on our kitchen floor. When Tommy finally opened his eyes, they didn't look right. They couldn't seem to focus on anything, and when he tried to sit up, he immediately fell back down. That's when I knew. This wasn't just another bad night. This wasn't something I could explain away or pray away or love away. Frank had crossed a line that no man should ever cross, and if I didn't do something, if I didn't act, one of my children was going to die. I carried Tommy to our bedroom and laid him on the bed, my hands trembling as I cleaned the blood from his head with a damp cloth. He was conscious now, thank God, but something was wrong. He kept trying to stand but would immediately fall back down, and his eyes couldn't seem to track properly when I moved my finger in front of his face. I knew enough about head injuries from growing up with 4 brothers to recognize the signs. My baby had a concussion, maybe worse, and there wasn't a thing I could do about it except pray and watch him through the night. Frank had passed out at the kitchen table, snoring like nothing had happened, like he hadn't just nearly killed his own son. Michael and Sarah huddled together in their bedroom, too scared to come out, whispering questions I couldn't answer. "Is Tommy going to be okay, Mama?" Sarah asked when I tucked them into bed hours later. "Is Daddy sick?" How do you explain to a 3-year-old that sometimes the people who are supposed to love and protect you are the very ones you need protection from? "Everything's going to be fine, sweetheart," I lied, kissing her forehead. "Just go to sleep now." But nothing was fine, and as I sat by Tommy's bedside that whole night, watching his shallow breathing, checking every few minutes to make sure he was still with me, I knew that something had to change. The question was what? What could a 21-year-old woman with 3 small children and no money do in 1962? I could leave, I told myself. Pack up the children in the middle of the night and go to my mother's house. But Mama had made it clear years ago that she thought I'd made my bed and needed to lie in it. Marriage is work, Dorothy, she'd said the one time I'd hinted that things weren't perfect. Your generation wants everything handed to you on a silver platter. A good woman makes her marriage work. Besides, even if Mama took us in, what then? Frank would come after us. He'd demand his children back, and legally, they were his property as much as mine. Maybe more so. A woman couldn't just take a man's children and disappear. The law was on his side, not mine. I could go to the police, report what Frank had done to Tommy. But what would I tell them? That my husband had been drinking and accidentally pushed our son too hard? That's what Frank would say, and who would believe otherwise? There were no witnesses except Michael and Sarah, and they were too young to testify. Besides, Sheriff McKinnon was Frank's drinking buddy. They'd served in Korea together before Frank got hurt and came home to work the mines. The sheriff would take one look at Frank's remorseful face and my tearful accusations and chalk it up to marital problems that weren't his business to solve. I could talk to Pastor Williams at the church. Surely a man of God would help a woman protect her children. But I already knew what he'd say because I'd heard him say it from the pulpit dozens of times. Wives, submit to your husbands. Turn the other cheek. Pray for those who persecute you. The church's answer to everything was prayer and patience and forgiveness. They'd tell me to be a better wife, to love Frank back to the man he used to be, to trust in God's plan even if I couldn't understand it. I could get a job, try to support the children on my own. But what kind of job could an uneducated woman get in Cedar Falls? Waitressing at the diner for tips that wouldn't pay the rent? Cleaning houses for the wealthy families on the hill for a few dollars a week? And who would watch the children while I worked? How could I protect them if I wasn't even there? Every option I considered led to the same dead end. Frank held all the cards, all the power, all the legal rights. He could hurt us and there was nothing, absolutely nothing, that the law or society or even the church would do to stop him. Worse than that, they'd all find ways to make it my fault. I wasn't submissive enough, wasn't loving enough, wasn't patient enough. A good wife would have prevented this somehow. A good mother would have protected her children better. As the night wore on and Tommy's breathing stayed steady but labored, as Frank snored drunkenly in the kitchen, as Michael and Sarah slept fitfully in their beds, I realized something that chilled me to the bone. This wasn't going to be the last time. Frank's violence was escalating, and there would be a next time, and a time after that, until one day one of my children didn't wake up at all. The thought of losing them, of failing in my most basic duty as their mother, filled me with a rage I'd never felt before. It was clean and sharp and purposeful, this rage. It cut through all my fear and uncertainty and social conditioning and left me with one crystal clear truth. I would do anything, anything at all, to protect my children. Anything. The word echoed in my mind as the first pale light of dawn crept through the bedroom window. Anything. Even if it meant going against everything I'd been taught about right and wrong. Even if it meant damning my own soul. Even if it meant becoming someone I'd never imagined I could be. Because being a good Christian woman hadn't protected my babies. Being a dutiful wife hadn't saved them. Following all the rules and keeping all the commandments hadn't prevented Tommy from being thrown against that wall like a broken toy. Sometimes, I realized, being good isn't enough. Sometimes love demands something darker. Something terrible. Something that would haunt me for the rest of my life but would let me sleep at night knowing my children were safe. By the time the sun was fully up, I had made my decision. Not the whole plan, not yet, but the decision that would set everything else in motion. I was going to act. For the first time in 3 years of marriage, I wasn't going to wait and hope and pray for things to get better. I wasn't going to make excuses or try to love Frank back to the man he used to be. I was going to take control of this situation before he killed one of my babies. Tommy was awake by then, sitting up slowly and asking for water in a voice that sounded too small and fragile. The relief of hearing him speak nearly brought me to my knees, but I could see he still wasn't right. His balance was off, and he kept touching his head where a purple bruise was blooming like a terrible flower. When Frank stumbled out of the kitchen around noon, hungover and reeking of stale whiskey, he took one look at Tommy and had the audacity to act surprised. "What happened to him?" he asked, like he genuinely didn't remember nearly killing his own son just hours before. "You hurt him, Frank," I said quietly, but something in my voice must have been different because he looked at me sharply. "I hurt him? Dorothy, I would never hurt my children. You know that." The ease with which the lie rolled off his tongue, the complete conviction in his voice, told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't just about drinking anymore. Frank had crossed over into something darker, something that allowed him to rewrite reality to suit his needs. A man who could throw a toddler against a wall and then forget about it entirely was a man who was capable of anything. "I know what I saw, Frank," I said, still keeping my voice level. "And so do the children." His face darkened at that, and for a moment I thought he might hit me right there in broad daylight with Tommy watching. Instead, he grabbed his coat and headed for the door. "I'm going to Murphy's," he said. "And when I get back, I don't want to hear any more of this nonsense." The moment the door slammed behind him, I sprang into action. I couldn't take the children and run, that much was clear. But there were other ways to solve this problem, ways that a desperate woman with nothing left to lose might consider. Ways that would have horrified the Dorothy May I'd been just 24 hours ago. I started by taking Tommy to see Dr. Patterson, the only doctor in Cedar Falls. I told him Tommy had fallen down the stairs, and he examined my baby with gentle hands and kind eyes. "He has a concussion," he confirmed what I already knew. "A pretty severe one. You'll need to watch him closely for the next few days. Wake him every few hours, make sure he's responsive. If he starts vomiting or seems confused, bring him back immediately." "Doctor," I said carefully, "what would cause an injury like this?" He looked at me for a long moment, and I could see him weighing his words. "A fall downstairs could do it," he said finally. "But Dorothy, this kind of injury, the pattern of the bruising, it's more consistent with trauma from impact against a flat surface." He knew. Somehow, he knew. And in his eyes, I saw something I hadn't expected. Not judgment, but understanding. "If you ever need help, Dorothy," he said quietly, "or if the children ever need somewhere safe to go, my wife and we have a big house. We'd find room." I thanked him and left, but his words stayed with me. There were people who would help, but only if I was brave enough to ask. Only if I was willing to admit that I couldn't handle this alone. But asking for help meant admitting defeat, and more than that, it meant putting other people at risk. Frank's anger wasn't something that would just disappear if we hid from it. It would follow us, find us, hurt anyone who tried to stand in its way. That afternoon, while Frank was drinking away his guilt at Murphy's Tavern, I did something I'd never done before. I went to the Cedar Falls Library and asked Mrs. Hutchinson, the librarian, if she had any books about the law. "The law, dear?" she asked, peering at me over her spectacles. "Is everything all right?" "I'm just curious about women's rights," I said, which wasn't entirely a lie. What options a woman has if she finds herself in a difficult situation. Mrs. Hutchinson's expression softened, and she led me to a small section in the back of the library. "These are all we have," she said, pulling out 3 thin volumes. "I'm afraid the law isn't very kind to women in difficult situations, Dorothy. But knowledge is power, as they say." I spent 2 hours reading those books, and what I learned confirmed my worst fears. A woman had virtually no legal recourse against an abusive husband. Divorce was nearly impossible to obtain and would leave me with nothing. The children would likely stay with Frank, since he was their legal guardian and the breadwinner. Even if I could prove abuse, which would be my word against his, the courts would probably recommend counseling or separation, not protection. The law wasn't going to save my children. The church wasn't going to save them. Society wasn't going to save them. If they were going to be safe, it would be because I made them safe. By whatever means necessary. As I walked home from the library that evening, my mind was clearer than it had been in months. I knew what I had to do. It would require careful planning, perfect timing, and a kind of courage I wasn't sure I possessed. It would mean becoming someone I'd never imagined I could be, crossing lines I'd never thought I'd cross. But as I looked at my children that night, as I saw the fear still lingering in Michael's eyes and the way Sarah flinched when she heard footsteps on the porch, I knew I didn't have a choice. Frank Sullivan was a threat to my children, and threats had to be eliminated. One way or another. The decision was made. Now all I had to do was find the strength to follow through. The next few weeks passed like a strange, suspended dream where I moved through my daily routines while my mind worked on a completely different level. To anyone watching, I was the same Dorothy Mae Sullivan I'd always been. I cooked Frank's meals, washed his clothes, kept the house clean, and tended to the children. But inside, I was changing, transforming into someone I barely recognized. Someone capable of things that would have horrified the woman I'd been just a month before. The first thing I did was start paying attention to Frank's patterns in a way I never had before. When did he drink the most? What triggered his worst episodes? How deeply did he sleep when he'd had too much whiskey? I began to study my own husband like he was a problem to be solved, which in many ways, he was. Frank was predictable in his unpredictability. He'd come home from the mines tired and irritable, but if he went straight to Murphy's Tavern after work, he'd return home around 10 o'clock, drunk but manageable. If he came home first and then went out drinking, he'd stumble back after midnight in a rage, looking for someone to blame for all his disappointments. Those were the nights when the children and I would lie in our beds, holding our breath and praying he'd pass out before he remembered he was angry about something. I started keeping a mental calendar of these patterns, noting which nights were safe and which ones we needed to be invisible. I also began to prepare the children, though they didn't know that's what I was doing. I taught them a new game called Quiet Time, where we would all practice being as silent as possible for as long as we could. It's like hide and seek, I told them, but instead of hiding our bodies, we're hiding our voices. Michael, my serious little boy, was especially good at this game. Sarah thought it was fun at first, but she got bored quickly and would start to giggle. Tommy, still recovering from his head injury, would fall asleep during our practice sessions, which was probably for the best. I also started teaching them about our neighbors in ways I never had before. You remember Mrs. Henderson next door? I'd say while we were hanging laundry. She's always home during the day, and she loves children. If Mama ever can't take care of you for a little while, Mrs. Henderson would be happy to help. Or while we walked to the market, I'd point out Dr. Patterson's house. The doctor lives right there, and his wife Mrs. Patterson makes the best cookies in town. They would take very good care of anyone who needed help. The children listened to these conversations with the trusting attention they gave to all my words, not understanding I was building them a map of safe places in case something happened to me. During this time, I also began to change my relationship with God. I'd been raised to believe that everything happened for a reason, that God had a plan even when we couldn't understand it, that suffering was sometimes necessary for spiritual growth. But as I knelt in church those Sunday mornings and listened to Pastor Williams preach about forgiveness and turning the other cheek, I realized that the God I'd been taught to worship was a God who would sacrifice my children on the altar of my marriage vows. That wasn't a God I could serve anymore. Instead, I began to pray to a different God, a mother's God, a God who understood that sometimes love required terrible choices. Lord, I would whisper into my pillow at night, I know what I'm thinking isn't right by the world's standards. But you gave me these children to protect, and I can't do that if I'm dead or if they're dead. If what I'm planning is wrong, send me a sign. Give me another way. But if you stay silent, I'll take that as permission to do what needs to be done. God stayed silent. 3 weeks after Tommy's injury, Frank had another one of his episodes. This time it was Michael who bore the brunt of his anger. My eldest son had spilled a glass of milk at dinner, just a childhood accident that shouldn't have mattered. But Frank exploded, screaming about waste and disrespect and ungrateful children. He grabbed Michael by the shirt and shook him so hard the boy's head snapped back and forth like a rag doll's. Please, Frank, I begged, he's just a little boy. It was an accident. Frank backhanded me without even looking in my direction, his attention focused entirely on Michael's terrified face. This is what happens when you don't teach children respect, he snarled. This is your fault, Dorothy. You're too soft on them. That night, after Frank had drunk himself into his usual stupor, I held Michael while he cried into my shoulder. His lip was split and already swelling, and there were finger-shaped bruises on his arms where Frank had grabbed him. I'm sorry, Mama, he kept saying. I didn't mean to spill the milk. I'll be more careful, I promise. My heart broke listening to my 4-year-old son apologize for being a child, for making the kind of innocent mistake that every child makes. This was what Frank was doing to them, teaching them that they were responsible for his violence, that they deserved to be hurt for the crime of being human. You didn't do anything wrong, sweetheart, I whispered, smoothing his dark hair. Sometimes grown-ups get sick in their hearts, and when that happens, they do things that aren't right. But it's not your fault. It's never your fault. But even as I comforted Michael, I was making calculations. Frank's violence was escalating. The time between episodes was getting shorter. The level of force he was using was increasing. It was only a matter of time before he seriously injured one of them, or worse. I couldn't wait any longer for a miracle or for Frank to change or for society to suddenly develop a conscience about protecting women and children. I had to act. The next day, I did something I'd never done before. I lied to my neighbor Mrs. Henderson and asked her to watch the children for an hour while I ran an errand in town. Instead of going to the market or the post office, I walked to the other side of Cedar Falls, to a part of town where the mining company had built housing for the unmarried workers. It was rougher there, full of men who worked dangerous jobs and lived hard lives, men who sometimes found themselves in situations where the normal rules didn't apply. I was looking for someone specific, a man Frank had mentioned in passing. Bobby Kowalski had worked with Frank in the mines until he'd been fired for fighting with a supervisor. Frank had said Bobby was trouble, the kind of man who didn't back down from anything and didn't ask too many questions about the jobs that came his way. The kind of man who might help a desperate woman solve an impossible problem. I found Bobby sitting on the steps of a rundown boarding house, drinking beer from a bottle and smoking a cigarette. He was younger than Frank, maybe 25, with scarred hands and the kind of hard eyes that said he'd seen enough of the world to know it wasn't a kind place. "You're Frank Sullivan's wife," he said when I approached. It wasn't a question. "I am," I replied, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "I need to talk to you about something. Something private." Bobby studied me for a long moment, taking in my church dress and carefully pinned hair, the way I held myself like a lady even in this rough part of town. "What kind of something?" "The kind that might be worth your while," I said, using words I'd rehearsed in my head 100 times. "If you're the kind of man who's willing to help someone in trouble." We talked for 20 minutes, dancing around the subject without ever saying anything directly. Bobby was smart enough to understand what I was hinting at, and practical enough to know that desperate people sometimes paid well for solutions to their problems. We didn't make any deals that day, didn't commit to anything specific. But we understood each other, and that was enough. For now. Walking home from that conversation, I felt like I was floating outside my own body, watching a woman who looked like me but couldn't possibly be me. Good Christian women didn't have conversations like that. Good mothers didn't consider the things I was considering. But good Christian women and good mothers had husbands who didn't throw their babies against walls. They had different problems that required different solutions. That night, as I tucked my children into bed and kissed their sweet faces, I made my peace with what I was becoming. If protecting them meant damning my soul, then so be it. If keeping them safe meant crossing lines that could never be uncrossed, then I would cross them gladly. Because at the end of the day, their lives mattered more than my conscience. Their safety mattered more than my salvation. And if that made me terrible, then I would be terrible with pride. The moment I'd been preparing for came on a cold November night, 3 weeks after my conversation with Bobby Kowalski. I'd been waiting, watching, planning, but I hadn't made any final arrangements yet. I kept telling myself I was just preparing for possibilities, just thinking through options in case things got worse. But deep down, I knew I was lying to myself. I was waiting for the right moment, the moment when Frank would cross the final line that would make my decision inevitable. That night started like so many others. Frank came home from the mines in a foul mood, muttering about layoffs and reduced hours, about how the company was bleeding them dry while the bosses got rich off their sweat. He barely acknowledged the children during dinner, just sat there drinking straight whiskey from a bottle he'd brought home, his eyes getting glassier and more dangerous with each sip. I tried to keep everything calm, speaking in soft tones, keeping the children quiet, clearing the table quickly so Frank wouldn't have anything to complain about. But I could feel the tension building like pressure in a kettle, ready to explode. Around 9 o'clock, Frank announced he was going to Murphy's Tavern, and part of me hoped he'd drink himself into unconsciousness there and we'd have a peaceful night. But he was back by 10:30, drunker than I'd ever seen him, stumbling through the front door with murder in his eyes. "Where are they?" he slurred, and I knew immediately what he meant. Earlier that week, some money had gone missing from the coffee can where Frank kept his drinking money. I'd suspected he'd just forgotten spending it, but now I could see he'd convinced himself that one of the children had taken it. "Frank, the children are asleep," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "And they didn't take any money. You know they wouldn't do that." "Don't lie to me," he roared, lurching toward the children's bedroom. "I'm gonna teach those little thieves a lesson they won't forget." I stepped in front of him, something I'd never dared to do before. "Frank, please. They're babies. They don't even know what money is for." He looked at me like I was an insect that had dared to crawl across his path. "Get out of my way, Dorothy. This is between me and them." "No," I said, and the word hung in the air between us like a gunshot. "I won't let you hurt them anymore." Frank's face went through a series of expressions, from surprise to rage to something that looked almost like amusement. "You won't let me?" He grabbed me by the throat and slammed me against the wall so hard my teeth rattled. "You seem to forget who's the man in this house." I could hear the children crying in their bedroom, could hear Michael trying to shush his younger siblings, trying to protect them the way I should have been protecting them. The sound of their fear gave me strength I didn't know I had. "Let go of me, Frank," I gasped, clawing at his hands around my throat. "You're drunk. Go to bed and sleep it off." Instead, he tightened his grip. "I'm gonna deal with those thieving kids, and then I'm gonna deal with you for raising them to be liars and thieves." Black spots were dancing at the edges of my vision, and I realized with crystal clarity that Frank was going to kill me. Right here, right now, with my children listening from the next room. And then he was going to hurt them in ways I couldn't even imagine, and there would be no one left to stop him. That's when something inside me broke, or maybe something finally snapped into place. This was the moment I'd been preparing for without knowing it. This was why God had stayed silent when I prayed for another way. Because there was no other way. There never had been. With the last of my strength, I brought my knee up hard between Frank's legs. He doubled over, gasping, his grip on my throat loosening just enough for me to break free. I ran to the kitchen, my mind perfectly clear for the first time in years. I knew exactly what I had to do. Behind me, I could hear Frank getting to his feet, cursing and stumbling. "Dorothy," he bellowed. "When I get my hands on you, you're gonna wish you'd never been born." But I wasn't thinking about what he was going to do to me anymore. I was thinking about my children, about Michael's split lip and Tommy's concussion and Sarah's nightmares. I was thinking about the conversation I'd had with Bobby Kowalski and the arrangements I could make with one phone call. I was thinking about a world where my babies could sleep peacefully without fear, where they could spill milk and laugh too loudly and just be children. And I was thinking that some prices were worth paying, even if it meant spending the rest of my life knowing what I'd done. I made the phone call that night while Frank was passed out on the kitchen floor, snoring like the drunk he'd become. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely dial the number Bobby Kowalski had given me, but my voice was steady when he answered. "It's Dorothy Sullivan," I whispered into the receiver. "We need to talk. Tonight." "I figured you'd call eventually," Bobby said, and I could hear him moving around, getting dressed probably. "Where do you want to meet?" "The old grain silo behind Miller's farm." 1 hour. I hung up before he could ask any questions, before I could change my mind, before the part of me that was still a good Christian woman could talk me out of what I was about to do. The walk to Miller's farm in the dark was the longest of my life. Every step took me further away from the woman I'd been and closer to someone I'd never imagined I could become. But with each footfall on that dirt road, I thought about Tommy's head hitting the kitchen wall, about Michael's split lip, about Sarah's frightened eyes. And I kept walking. Bobby was already there when I arrived, leaning against his truck and smoking a cigarette in the darkness. "You look like hell, Mrs. Sullivan," he said, not unkindly. "I feel like hell," I replied. "But that doesn't change what needs to be done." We talked for an hour in whispers, working out details I won't repeat here, making arrangements that would haunt my dreams for the rest of my life. Bobby asked me 3 times if I was sure, and 3 times I said yes, thinking of my children sleeping fitfully in their beds, afraid of their own father. "This isn't something you can take back," he warned me. "Once it's done, it's done. You understand that?" I understood. God help me, I understood completely. "How much?" I asked, though I knew I didn't have much to offer. "I don't want your money," Bobby said. "My old man used to beat the hell out of me and my ma until she finally took us and ran. Some things ain't about money." The plan was simple, which made it even more terrible somehow. Frank had a pattern of walking home from Murphy's Tavern along the railroad tracks when he was too drunk to navigate the main road. It was isolated there, dark, and accidents happened all the time. Men who'd had too much to drink sometimes miscalculated the timing of the late freight train, or they'd stumble and fall, hit their heads on the rails. The sheriff would investigate, of course, but everyone knew Frank Sullivan was a drunk who walked the tracks at night. It wouldn't be hard to believe he'd finally made a fatal mistake. "When?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "Tomorrow night," Bobby said. "Friday's his heaviest drinking night, right? He'll be walking those tracks around midnight, drunk as a skunk like always." I nodded, unable to speak around the lump in my throat. This was really happening. I was really planning my husband's death like it was a grocery list or a church social. "You go home now," Bobby said gently. "Kiss your kids, go to bed, and tomorrow night you make sure you're somewhere with witnesses. Visit your sister, go to the church social, something where people will remember seeing you." "And Mrs. Sullivan?" "Yes?" "After tomorrow, we never spoke. You don't know me, and I don't know you. Understand?" I understood. I walked home in a daze, feeling like I was floating outside my own body. When I got there, Frank was still unconscious on the kitchen floor, and the children were finally asleep, exhausted from crying. I checked on each of them, kissing their foreheads and whispering promises they couldn't hear. "Tomorrow you'll be safe," I told Tommy, smoothing his hair. "Tomorrow everything will be different." The next day was the longest of my life. I moved through my usual routines like a sleepwalker, cooking Frank's breakfast, washing clothes, tending to the children. Frank was hungover and mean, but not violent, just sullen and complaining about the noise the children made when they played. "Keep those kids quiet," he growled from his chair, holding his head in his hands. "A man can't even have peace in his own home." I wanted to scream at him that peace was the last thing he'd brought to this home, that my children flinched every time he raised his voice, that they'd learned to tiptoe around their own father like he was a dangerous animal. Instead, I just nodded and herded the children outside to play in the yard. That evening, I made Frank's favorite dinner, pot roast with all the fixings. I told myself it was because I wanted his last meal to be a good one, but the truth was I didn't know how else to act normal when everything inside me was screaming. Frank ate without comment, then announced he was going to Murphy's like it was any other Friday night. "Don't wait up," he said, grabbing his coat. "I might be late." He had no idea he'd never be coming home at all. After he left, I gathered the children and told them we were going to visit Mrs. Henderson for the evening. "But it's past our bedtime," Sarah protested. "It's a special night," I said, which was true in the most terrible way possible. "Mrs. Henderson wants to show you her new kittens." The children were delighted, and we spent the evening at Mrs. Henderson's house, playing with the kittens and eating cookies while I watched the clock and counted down the hours. Mrs. Henderson chattered about church gossip and the weather while I made appropriate responses, all the while thinking about what was happening on those railroad tracks. At exactly 12:15, we heard the train whistle in the distance, long and mournful in the night air. My blood turned to ice water in my veins, and I had to grip the arm of Mrs. Henderson's sofa to keep from collapsing. "Are you all right, dear?" Mrs. Henderson asked, noticing my face had gone white. "You look like you've seen a ghost." In a way, I had. I'd seen the ghost of the woman I used to be, and she was gone forever. "I'm fine," I managed to say. "Just tired." "It's been a long day." We stayed until nearly 1 o'clock, and then I walked the children home through the quiet streets of Cedar Falls. Frank's house key was still in my purse, cold and heavy like a stone. When we got home, the house was dark and empty, exactly as I'd expected it to be. I tucked the children into bed, and for the first time in years, I didn't have to worry about them waking up to the sound of their father's angry voice or heavy footsteps. They were safe now. They were finally, truly safe. But as I lay in my own bed that night, staring at the ceiling and listening to the silence where Frank's snoring used to be, I realized that safety had come at a price I was only beginning to understand. I had saved my children, but in doing so, I had become someone I didn't recognize. I had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, made a choice that would define the rest of my life. The worst part wasn't the guilt, though that was crushing. The worst part was that I didn't regret it. Even lying there in the dark, knowing what I'd done, knowing that I'd helped orchestrate the death of my children's father, I couldn't bring myself to wish I'd made a different choice. And that terrified me more than anything Frank had ever done. Sheriff McKinnon came to my door at 7 o'clock the next morning, his hat in his hands and his face grave. I was making breakfast for the children, scrambling eggs and trying to act like a woman who didn't know her husband was dead, when I heard his heavy boots on the front porch. "Mrs. Sullivan," he said when I opened the door, "I'm afraid I have some bad news about Frank." I let my face crumble in all the right ways, let my hand fly to my throat in the gesture of a shocked wife. "What's happened?" I whispered, though my heart was pounding so hard I was sure he could hear it. "There's been an accident. Frank was walking home from Murphy's last night, and it appears he fell on the railroad tracks. The midnight freight train, well. He didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. I collapsed into a chair and started crying, real tears that came from a place I didn't expect. Not tears of grief for Frank, but tears of relief so overwhelming I couldn't contain them. My children were safe. The nightmare was over. The sheriff was kind, helping me to the kitchen and getting me a glass of water while I sobbed into my hands. "I know this is a shock, Dorothy," he said gently. "Frank had his problems, but I know you loved him. If only he knew how complicated love could be, how it could twist and turn and become something unrecognizable. I had loved Frank once, the man he'd been when we first married. But that man had died long before his body hit those railroad tracks. The man who'd terrorized my children, who'd thrown Tommy against the wall and split Michael's lip, that man I didn't mourn at all. Was he drinking?" I asked through my tears, playing the part of the concerned wife trying to understand. "I'm afraid so," Sheriff McKinnon said. "Murphy said he'd had quite a bit before he left the tavern. You know how Frank was about walking those tracks when he'd had too much. I warned him more than once it was dangerous, but he said it was the quickest way home." The investigation was perfunctory, exactly as Bobby had predicted. Frank Sullivan, known drunk, walking railroad tracks at night, hit by a train. It was a tragedy, but not a mystery. The sheriff asked me a few questions about Frank's state of mind, whether he'd seemed depressed or suicidal, but I assured him that Frank had been his usual self, just tired from work and worried about the layoffs at the mine. He wasn't the type to give up, I said, which was true in its way. Frank would have kept hurting us until someone stopped him, and now someone had. Mrs. Henderson confirmed that I'd been at her house until after 1 o'clock, playing with the children and having coffee. The timeline worked perfectly. Frank had left Murphy's around 11:30, according to the bartender, and the train engineer said he'd felt the impact just after midnight. I had an unshakable alibi, and no one had any reason to suspect that Frank Sullivan's grieving widow had orchestrated his death. The funeral was 3 days later, a small affair at the Baptist church with most of the town in attendance. People said all the right things about Frank being reunited with the Lord, about him being at peace now, about what a tragedy it was for such a young family to lose their father. I stood at the graveside in my black dress, holding Tommy on my hip while Michael and Sarah clung to my skirt, and I played the part of the devastated widow perfectly. But inside, I was celebrating. Inside, I was singing hymns of thanksgiving that my children would never again have to hide in their bedroom while their father raged in the kitchen. The hardest part came after everyone left, when it was just me and the children in our suddenly quiet house. Michael, my serious little boy, looked up at me with eyes too old for his face and asked, "Mama, is Daddy really never coming home?" "No, sweetheart," I said, gathering him close. "Daddy had an accident, and he went to live with Jesus. It's just us now." "Good," Sarah said with the brutal honesty of a 3-year-old. "Daddy was scary. I didn't like when he yelled." Tommy was too young to understand what death meant, but he seemed to sense the change in the atmosphere. He stopped flinching when he heard footsteps, stopped crying inconsolably for no reason. All 3 of them began to relax in ways I hadn't seen in years, like flowers opening to sunlight after a long winter. But my own reckoning was just beginning. The first week after Frank's death, I was busy with practical matters, dealing with the mine's compensation office, sorting through Frank's few belongings, accepting casseroles and condolences from well-meaning neighbors. I was so focused on taking care of everyone else that I didn't have time to think about what I'd done. It was the second week when it hit me, the full weight of the choice I'd made. I was sitting on the front porch one evening, watching the children play in the yard without fear for the first time in years, when the reality crashed over me like a wave. I had killed my husband. Maybe I hadn't pushed him in front of that train myself, maybe I hadn't put my hands around his throat or pulled a trigger, but I had orchestrated his death as surely as if I had. I was a murderer. The word sat in my mind like a stone, cold and heavy and undeniable. I had taken a life, ended Frank's existence because it was inconvenient to mine, because he was a threat to what I wanted to protect. Good Christian women didn't do such things. Good mothers found other ways to solve their problems. But as I watched Michael laugh without looking over his shoulder, as I saw Sarah play without jumping at every sound, as I held Tommy close without worrying about bruises the next day, I couldn't bring myself to regret what I'd done. Frank's death had given my children their lives back. It had given me my life back. How could I regret that? The guilt was like a living thing inside me, gnawing at my conscience during the day and keeping me awake at night. I started having dreams where Frank came back, where he stood at the foot of my bed with his face smashed from the train wheels, asking me why I'd killed him. I'd wake up screaming, and the children would come running to comfort me, thinking I was having nightmares about missing their father. If only they knew I was having nightmares about what I'd done to him. I tried praying, but the words felt hollow in my mouth. How do you ask God for forgiveness when you're not sorry for what you've done? How do you repent of a sin you'd commit again in a heartbeat if it meant protecting your children? I found myself crying at odd moments, not from grief but from the sheer weight of carrying such a secret. I'd be folding laundry or stirring soup, and suddenly I'd be sobbing, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what I'd done and what it meant about who I was as a person. The worst moment came 3 weeks after Frank's death, when Tommy crawled into my lap and patted my face with his little hands. "Don't cry, Mama," he said in his sweet baby voice. "Daddy can't hurt us anymore." The innocence in his words, the relief, the simple truth of what Frank's death had meant to him, broke something inside me. This child, this precious little boy who'd been thrown against a wall by his own father, was comforting me for the very thing that had saved his life. He was grateful for his father's death, and he didn't even understand why. That night, I made peace with what I'd done. Not because it was right, not because I could justify it to God or to society or to my own conscience, but because it was necessary. Sometimes love requires terrible choices. Sometimes protecting the innocent means becoming something you never wanted to be. Sometimes being a good mother means being a bad person. I had traded my soul for my children's safety, and it was a bargain I would make again and again, world without end. But knowing I'd made the right choice didn't make it easier to live with. It just made it possible. Life after Frank's death was like learning to walk again after years of crawling. Everything was different, from the way sound carried through our house to how the children moved through their days. For the first time in years, there was no need to listen for footsteps on the porch with dread, no need to gauge moods and tiptoe around explosive anger. The silence in our home wasn't oppressive anymore, it was peaceful. But rebuilding our lives wasn't as simple as I'd imagined it would be. The mine provided a small pension for Frank's death, barely enough to cover rent and food, and I quickly realized that financial survival as a widow with 3 small children was going to be a constant struggle. I couldn't rely on the kindness of neighbors forever, and Cedar Falls wasn't a place where a woman had many options for supporting herself. I started by taking in laundry and mending for other families, work I could do at home while watching the children. My hands, which had once been soft from the luxury of being a housewife, became rough and red from lye soap and constant scrubbing. I worked from dawn until late at night, washing and pressing other people's clothes while my own children played quietly around me, still programmed to be invisible even though the threat was gone. Within a month of Frank's death, I knew I couldn't make ends meet just doing laundry. Dr. Patterson, the kind man who'd examined Tommy after his head injury, offered me work cleaning his medical office and assisting with simple tasks. It wasn't much money, but it was steady, and it meant I could bring Tommy with me during the day while Michael and Sarah were at school. Dr. Patterson never asked directly about Frank's drinking or what our home life had been like, but I could see in his eyes that he understood more than he let on. "You're a strong woman, Dorothy," he told me one afternoon as I was mopping his office floors. "Your children are lucky to have you." If he only knew just how far I'd gone to protect them, would he still think I was strong, or would he see me for what I really was? The children adapted to our new life with a resilience that both amazed and broke my heart. Michael, at barely 5 years old, appointed himself the man of the house, trying to help with chores and watching over his younger siblings with a seriousness that no child should have to carry. Sarah blossomed without her father's angry presence, her natural chattiness returning as she realized she could laugh and play without consequences. And Tommy, my baby who'd borne the worst of Frank's violence, began to sleep through the night for the first time in months. But they had questions, innocent questions that cut right through me. "Why don't we have a daddy anymore?" Sarah asked one evening as I tucked her into bed. "Everyone else at church has a daddy. How do you explain to a 3-year-old that sometimes daddies hurt their families so badly that they have to go away forever? How do you tell her that her father's death was the best thing that could have happened to her?" "Some families are different," I said, smoothing her hair. "We have each other, and that's what matters. Mama will always take care of you." The hardest questions came from Michael, who remembered more than I wished he did. "Mama," he said one day while we were hanging laundry, "did Daddy go to heaven? Pastor William said at the funeral that Daddy went to be with Jesus, but Daddy was mean to us. Do mean people go to heaven?" I stopped what I was doing and knelt down to look my son in the eyes. This was the moment I'd been dreading, the conversation that would either help him heal or burden him with confusion he was too young to understand. "God sees into people's hearts," I said carefully. "Your daddy wasn't always mean. Before you were born, before he started drinking so much, he was kind and gentle. Sometimes people get sick in ways we can't see, and the sickness makes them do bad things. But the person they used to be, the good part of them, that's what God judges." It was the best answer I could give, though I wasn't sure I believed it myself. The truth was, I didn't know what happened to men like Frank after they died, and I didn't much care. What mattered was that he couldn't hurt my children anymore. As the months passed, I began to see the true cost of what I'd done, not just to Frank but to myself. I would never be able to remarry, never be able to trust another man completely, because I would always know what I was capable of when pushed too far. I would never be able to confess to a priest or share my burden with a friend, because some secrets are too dangerous to speak aloud. I would spend the rest of my life carrying the weight of Frank's death alone, watching my children grow up healthy and happy while knowing that their freedom had come at the price of their father's life. But when I watched Tommy take his first steps without fear, when I saw Michael smile without looking over his shoulder, when I heard Sarah's laughter ring through our house like music, I knew I had made the right choice. Some prices are worth paying, even if you have to pay them for the rest of your life. The years passed like pages in a book I couldn't stop reading, each one carrying me further away from that November night in 1962 but never letting me forget it entirely. I raised my children as a single mother in a time when that meant whispers behind church pews and sideways glances at the grocery store. Widow was a respectable title, but it came with its own kind of loneliness, especially when the secret of how you became one ate at your soul like acid. By 1965, Michael was 8 and serious beyond his years, Sarah was 6 and full of questions about everything, and Tommy was 5 with no memory of his father's violence but somehow still flinching whenever men raised their voices. I had found steadier work as a nurse's aide at the county hospital, a job that required me to tend to broken bodies while my own spirit remained fractured in ways no medicine could heal. The work was hard but honest, and it allowed me to support my children without relying on the charity of others. More importantly, it gave me purpose beyond my guilt. Every patient I comforted, every hand I held during someone's final moments, felt like a small payment toward the debt I owed for Frank's life. I never dated, never even considered remarrying, though there were men who showed interest over the years. Dr. Patterson's younger brother asked me to dinner in 1967, and the new preacher who came to our church in 1969 made it clear he'd welcome my company. But how could I let another man into my life when I knew what I was capable of? How could I trust myself not to solve problems the same way again if pushed too far? The secret I carried made me feel separate from other people, like there was an invisible wall between me and the rest of the world. I went through the motions of normal life, attending church socials and PTA meetings, chatting with neighbors over backyard fences, but I was always performing the role of Dorothy Mae Sullivan, respectable widow and devoted mother. The real me, the woman who had orchestrated her husband's death, remained hidden behind a carefully constructed facade. The children grew up healthy and strong, and that was all that mattered. Michael became the kind of young man who helped elderly neighbors with their groceries and never raised his voice in anger. Sarah developed into a bright, confident girl who wasn't afraid to speak her mind or take up space in the world. Tommy grew tall and gentle, with a natural kindness that seemed to come from having been protected from the worst of human nature when it mattered most. They never asked detailed questions about their father as they got older, seeming to understand instinctively that some subjects were better left alone. I think they sensed that Frank's death had saved them, even if they couldn't articulate how or why. By the time they were teenagers, Frank was just a vague memory of fear and loud voices, a shadow from their early childhood that had no power over their present lives. But there were moments when the weight of my secret felt unbearable. Late at night, after the children were asleep, I would sit on the front porch where I'd once waited for Frank to come home drunk and angry, and I would remember every detail of that conversation with Bobby Kowalski. I would think about the sound the train whistle made that night at Mrs. Henderson's house, and wonder if Frank had time to understand what was happening to him in those final seconds. Did he think of his children? Did he remember throwing Tommy against the wall? Did he feel any regret for what he'd put us through? Sometimes I would catch myself looking for Bobby Kowalski in town, wondering if he'd kept his promise to forget we'd ever met. I never saw him again after that night, and eventually I heard he'd moved away, probably to some other town where he could start fresh without carrying the weight of other people's desperate choices. The closest I ever came to confessing was in 1978, when Tommy was 21 and getting ready to marry a sweet girl named Linda. I was helping him move his things out of our house, and he stopped to look at the old wedding photo of Frank and me that I'd kept on the mantel all those years. "Mama," he said quietly, "I know Daddy wasn't a good man. I don't remember much, but I remember being afraid all the time when I was little. I just want you to know that I'm grateful you kept us safe, whatever that meant." He didn't ask questions, didn't press for details, but something in his eyes told me he understood more than he let on. In that moment, I realized that my children had grown up knowing they'd been protected, even if they didn't know the cost of that protection. And maybe that was enough. Maybe some secrets were meant to be carried alone, buried so deep that even the people you'd die for never had to know what you'd done to save them. The silence I'd chosen wasn't just about protecting myself, it was about protecting them from the knowledge of what their mother was capable of. Some burdens are too heavy to share, even with the people you love most. It wasn't until I was 73 years old that I began to understand that maybe, just maybe, I wasn't the monster I'd believed myself to be for over 40 years. The moment of grace came in the most unexpected way, through a young woman named Jennifer who was brought to the emergency room where I'd been volunteering since my retirement from the hospital. She was 22, barely older than I'd been when I made my terrible choice, and she came in with injuries that told a story I knew all too well. A broken wrist that she claimed came from falling downstairs. Bruises on her ribs that she said were from a car accident. But it was the look in her eyes that I recognized, that desperate, trapped look of a woman who was running out of options and running out of hope. More heartbreaking still was the little girl clinging to her leg, maybe 3 years old, with the same fearful way of watching adults that my own children had once had. When the doctor stepped out to get her x-rays, Jennifer grabbed my hand with her good one. "Please," she whispered, "don't call the police. If they come, if they ask questions, he'll know I talked. He'll kill me. He said he'd kill me if I ever told anyone." I looked into those young eyes and saw myself at 21, pregnant with possibility and trapped in a nightmare. "Honey," I said gently, "what's your husband's name?" "Brad," she whispered. "Brad Morrison." He works at the new plant outside town. Everyone thinks he's such a good man, such a good provider. They don't know what he's like when he drinks, what he does when nobody's watching. I held her hand and thought about all the ways the world had changed since 1962, and all the ways it had stayed exactly the same. There were shelters now, hotlines, laws that were supposed to protect women like Jennifer. But here she was, just as trapped and terrified as I'd been, just as convinced that there was no way out that wouldn't cost her everything. "Listen to me," I said, my voice steady with 40 years of hard-won wisdom. "There are people who can help you now. Safe places you can go with your daughter. Legal ways to protect yourself that didn't exist when I was your age." "But he'll find me," she said, tears streaming down her face. "He says he'll take Emma away from me, that no judge will give a child to a woman who can't even keep house properly. He says it's all my fault, that I make him angry, that if I was a better wife." "Stop," I said firmly. "Stop right there. Nothing you do or don't do makes you deserve to be hurt. Nothing your baby does makes her deserve to live in fear. You are not responsible for his violence, do you hear me?" Over the next hour, while the doctors tended to her injuries, I gave Jennifer information I'd spent decades learning. Phone numbers for domestic violence shelters, names of lawyers who worked pro bono for abused women, resources that might help her escape without having to make the kind of choice I'd made. When she left that night, she hugged me tight and whispered, "Thank you for believing me. Thank you for not telling me to pray harder or try to love him back to being good." After she was gone, I sat in that hospital corridor and cried for the first time in years. Not tears of guilt or shame, but tears of understanding. I realized that in all my years of carrying the weight of Frank's death, I'd never allowed myself to see the truth of what I'd been facing. I'd been so focused on the terrible thing I'd done that I'd forgotten the impossible situation that had driven me to it. Jennifer had options I'd never had, resources that didn't exist in 1962, laws that might actually protect her. But even with all those advantages, she was still trapped, still terrified, still convinced that there was no way out. How much more trapped had I been, with 3 small children and no money and no legal recourse and a society that told women to endure whatever their husbands did to them? For the first time in 40 years, I allowed myself to feel something other than guilt about that November night. Not pride, never that, but a kind of sad understanding that I'd done the only thing I could think of to protect my children. I'd made a terrible choice because I'd been given only terrible options. That didn't make it right, but maybe it made it human. Over the following months, Jennifer became like a daughter to me. I helped her navigate the legal system, held her hand through court dates, watched Emma while she testified against Brad. When the judge granted her full custody and a restraining order, when she moved into her own apartment with help from the domestic violence program, I felt something I hadn't experienced in decades, the sense that some good had come from my pain. I couldn't bring Frank back, couldn't undo what I'd done or take back the choice I'd made. But maybe I could use the wisdom I'd gained from carrying that burden to help other women find better solutions. Maybe my terrible secret could serve a purpose beyond just eating away at my soul. It wasn't redemption, not complete redemption. But it was a beginning. And so here I am, 81 years old, sitting on the same front porch where I once waited in terror for Frank to come home drunk and violent. The house is different now, painted a cheerful yellow instead of the drab white it used to be, with flower boxes that Michael built for me last spring. The neighborhood has changed too, filled with young families whose children play in yards without fear, whose fathers come home from work with smiles instead of fists. But the memories remain, as clear and sharp as the day they were made. I still have Frank's wedding ring in that old tin box, though I'm not sure why I've kept it all these years. Maybe it's because it's the only proof left that any of it really happened, that I really made the choice that saved my children and damned my soul. Maybe it's because some burdens are too heavy to put down, even when you've learned to carry them with grace. My children are grown now, with children of their own. Michael became a teacher, gentle and patient with his students in ways his father never was with him. Sarah became a social worker, dedicating her life to helping troubled families find their way to safety. And Tommy, my baby who was thrown against that kitchen wall, became a pediatric nurse, spending his days healing children who remind me of who he used to be. They don't know what I did for them, and they never will. But sometimes I catch them looking at me with a kind of wondering gratitude, as if they understand on some level that their peaceful childhoods came at a price they can't imagine. They visit me often, bringing their children to play in the same yard where they once hid from their father's rage. My grandchildren climb the same apple tree, catch fireflies in the same mason jars, sleep peacefully in bedrooms that once echoed with frightened whispers. Watching them laugh without looking over their shoulders, seeing them run to their fathers for hugs instead of hiding, I know that everything I sacrificed was worth it. The guilt hasn't left me, probably never will. Some nights I still wake up thinking about that train whistle, about the conversation with Bobby Kowalski, about the moment I chose to become someone I never thought I could be. But the guilt is different now, tempered by understanding and softened by time. I was 21 years old, trapped in an impossible situation with 3 babies to protect. I made the only choice I could see, and I've spent 60 years living with the consequences. Was it right? I don't know. Maybe that's not for me to judge. Was it necessary? Yes. God help me, yes it was. As the sun sets over Cedar Falls, painting the sky the same colors it was on that last night with Frank, I close the tin box and set it aside. Tomorrow I'll wake up as I have for 60 years, carrying my secret and wearing my mask, playing the role of the respectable widow who lost her husband to a tragic accident. But tonight, for just these few moments, I'll allow myself to be the woman who saved her children the only way she knew how. And maybe, just maybe, that's enough. Maybe some sins are forgiven not through confession or penance, but through the love that motivated them in the first place. Maybe some prices are worth paying, even if you have to pay them alone, even if you have to carry them forever. My children are safe. My grandchildren are loved. And I am finally, after all these years, at peace with what I am. If you're listening to this story and you're in a situation like I was, if you're trapped with someone who hurts you or your children, please know that you have options I never had. There are people who will believe you, places that will keep you safe, laws that will protect you. You don't have to make the choice I made. You don't have to carry the weight I've carried for 60 years. Call the domestic violence hotline. Reach out to a women's shelter. Talk to someone you trust. There are better ways now, legal ways, safe ways to protect the people you love. And if you're someone who's made choices you can't take back, choices that haunt your dreams and follow you through your days, know that you're not alone. Sometimes love demands terrible things from us. Sometimes protecting the innocent means becoming something we never wanted to be. That doesn't make it right, but it might make it human. We carry our secrets and our sins because we must, because the alternative was unthinkable, because someone had to pay the price for safety and peace. I've told you this story not because I'm proud of what I did, but because silence has its own kind of weight, and after 60 years, I needed someone to know. I needed someone to understand that sometimes there are no good choices, only necessary ones. My name is Dorothy Mae Sullivan. I'm 81 years old, and this is the story I've never told anyone until now. I hope you never have to understand why I did what I did. But if you do, I hope you'll remember that you're stronger than you know, and that love, even the terrible kind, sometimes finds a way. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the choices we make for the people we love, please share it with someone who might need to hear it. And remember, sometimes the bravest thing you can do is ask for help before you're forced to help yourself. Thank you for listening. Thank you for not judging. And thank you for understanding that some stories need to be told, even when they're almost too heavy to bear.